The reduction in headache frequency is down to about 10 or 12%.
Stop being stuck.
Omega-3s can be sourced from food, both animal-based and plant-based. You can simply go online and look up the various food-based sources. But in thinking about headache and different treatments for headache, there are some recent studies exploring how supplementing with omega-3 fatty acids, and in one case, how supplementing with omega-3 fatty acids and deliberately reducing the amount of linoleic acid, the omega-6 fatty acids, how that can impact headache. The basic takeaway that they're relying on marching into the study is that increasing omega-3s and reducing omega-6s seems to be beneficial for reducing pain. And indeed, in this study, they find something quite similar, which is that when you hold caloric intake constant and when you look at omega-6s, whether or not you decrease omega-6 fatty acids or not, you find is that increasing omega-3 fatty acids in the diet was associated with a lower prevalence of severe headache or migraine, so severe tension type headache or migraine. So this is promising and points to the fact that long-chain omega-3 fatty acids are likely to have either a pain-reducing and or an inflammation-reducing effect that can significantly reduce the severity of headache in both tension type headache and in migraine. So if you're taking supplemental fish oil or you're getting your omega-3s from food and you're getting what you determine to be 2,000 milligrams or 2 grams per day of omega-3s, keep in mind that's going to include EPA and DHA. And it does seem that getting above 1 gram per day of EPA omega-3 fatty acids, either through food or supplements or both, is going to be the critical threshold for reductions in the frequency and intensity of headaches that include both tension headaches and migraine headaches. Now, some people will find that ingesting far more omega-3 fatty acids can also be beneficial for other things such as mood, and indeed there's a whole literature related to effects of ingesting 1 to 3 grams per day of EPA. So that's going to require quite a high intake of omega-3s in whatever form. Omega-3s are not just something that comes from food or supplements, they are also being marketed as prescription drugs. So I do think they need to be considered as quite potent. Acupuncture, yes, indeed, it really does work for relieving pain. And laboratories, both in the United States, such as Chufu's, and elsewhere, are starting to find the underlying mechanisms. And those mechanisms include deactivation of the pain pathways, activation of some of the parallel pathways that assist in shutting down pain or in relaxing the muscles that are causing tension type headache, as well as activation of neural pathways that impinge on organs that then cause or reduce the release of molecules into the body that give us the experience of pain. So reduce inflammation and in many cases increasing anti-inflammatory pathways. So I just want to be sure to mention acupuncture and a little bit of mechanistic understanding of why acupuncture works, because indeed acupuncture is shown to be quite effective for the treatment of tension type headache and to some extent migraine headache as well. There seems to be a kind of bimodal distribution whereby some people, when they drink caffeine, it really improves their headache. In some cases, very significant effects. Whereas other people, when they drink caffeine, it really exacerbates their headache. And at least as far as I could tell from the literature, it's not easy to predict who those people are going to be. And if you're wondering why it's so confusing, it's because caffeine hits both the vasodilation and the vasoconstriction pathways, and there's nothing you or I or anyone else can do about it. Curcumin is often also referred to as turmeric. It's known to have very potent anti-inflammatory properties. I don't think that's debated at all. In fact, it's so potent as an anti-inflammatory that some people have cautioned against taking high levels of curcumin prior to, for instance, resistance training workouts or even cardiovascular workouts, because it so prevents inflammation that it also can prevent the adaptation response. Curcumin dosages range anywhere from 80 milligrams per day, that is, taken for 8 weeks' time. That's been examined. It's been explored at 80 milligram dosages taken alongside 2.5 grams of omega-3 fatty acids or omega-3 fatty acids alone. General conclusion of these studies is that curcumin, when taken at dosages of about 80 milligrams, although for those of you very sensitive to curcumin, probably as low as 25 or even 50 milligrams per day, in conjunction with omega-3 fatty acids at 2.5 grams per day, led to significant improvements in migraine and other forms of headache, meaning both the frequency and the intensity of the headaches that occurred was greatly reduced. Creatine, and in particular the phosphorylated form of creatine, which is the readily available fuel source form of creatine, can also be stored in brain tissue and is actually quite prominently stored in the forebrain, the area where the real estate of your brain just behind the forehead, which is involved in planning and action and understanding context. So it's very important for cognition. It's important for personality too. It's important for a number of different aspects of life that have to do with making plans, being able to focus very intensely on your work, etc., or on anything for that matter. All functions that become heavily disrupted in people who have traumatic brain injury and concussion. Creatine's ability to communicate with the calcium in the ATP system was the motivation behind this study. That is, the authors hypothesized on the basis of preclinical data in animals that by increasing creatine stores within the brain, not just in the muscle, but in particular within the brain, that the availability of creatine would allow for better cognitive function in general. Now, they didn't look at cognition specifically in this paper, but they did look at the other aspects, that is the bad stuff associated with TBI. And they had people supplement with creatine at a level that is much higher than the typical level that people supplement with creatine simply for sports performance. In this study, they had people take a dose of 0.4 grams of creatine monohydrate per kilogram of body weight. So for somebody that weighs 100 kilograms or 220 pounds, that would be 40 grams of creatine per day. If someone weighs half that much, they would take 20 grams of creatine per day. And they did that over a period of 6 months. And we know that when you take creatine over and over day to day, that there's a buildup of creatine stores both in the muscles and within the brain tissue. And what they found as a consequence of this creatine administration was really striking and I think quite exciting. They found a very significant decrease in the frequency of headache in people that were supplementing with creatine as opposed to the controls. Now, keep in mind that this is a pilot study, but the effects are very dramatic. They found a very statistically significant decrease in the frequency of headache in people that were taking creatine. In fact, if you look at the controls and you see that they're basically getting headache at a frequency of 90% or more after TBI, the reduction in headache frequency is down to about 10 or 12% in the people taking creatines. They found is that the number of people experiencing dizziness was significantly reduced in people supplementing with creatine, as was the number of people experiencing fatigue, acute fatigue and chronic fatigue. Again, not chronic fatigue syndrome per se, but chronic fatigue, which was in this study defined as a general sense of bodily weakness and even mental weakness. The takeaway of this study is that for people experiencing headache, dizziness, and fatigue due to TBI, and perhaps, and I want to underline perhaps because it hasn't really been explored yet, but perhaps headache, dizziness, and fatigue due to other conditions or causes of headache, creatine monohydrate supplementation might be an excellent candidate for people to try. Why do we say that? Well, first of all, creatine monohydrate is relatively inexpensive. It's considered safe at the dosages used in this study and certainly for sports performance as well. And there are very few other compounds that have been shown to have as significant an impact on headache over the long term as has creatine monohydrate. There are certain oils that are available over the counter that when looked at in many studies, meta-analyses, they show that they can reduce the frequency and intensity of headache in a manner that far outpaces what you observe with non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs, with apparently none of the same issues associated with non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs. What they did is they recreated headache in human subjects by using tightening cuffs of the head. They cut off blood supply to certain areas of the head. They basically induced headache, and then they measured things like the EMG, the muscle response at the level of electrophysiology in the muscle, and of course subjective measures of how much people perceive to be in pain or not in pain. They had one group apply peppermint oil, but that peppermint oil also contained eucalyptus oil. They had another group use just peppermint oil. They had another group use just tiny traces of peppermint oil and smaller doses of eucalyptus oil. And then they had a fourth group which was just using placebo. When I say using, what they were doing is they were sponge applying the oil to the temples and forehead of people. And then what they did is they used these different approaches to measure the activation of muscles, to measure pain. They induced headache. When they looked at the temporal muscles, so on the side, they looked at forehead muscles, things of that sort. So they used 3 different types of pain stimuli. They looked at people's sensitivity to experimentally induced pain. They had the effect of significantly reducing the intensity of the pain. That is, subjects could tolerate the pain far better and experienced less pain subjectively. And the magnitude of the effects were really pretty impressive. It turns out that these essential oils, at least the ones that contain peppermint oil, with or without eucalyptus oil, perform very well in reducing pain. The key takeaway from the study is, and here I'm paraphrasing from the study, that the combination of peppermint oil, eucalyptus oil, and these are basically in a ethanol suspension. Again, people are not drinking these essential oils. I want to be very clear. They are applying these to the skin around the area that's in pain, in particular the temple and the foreheads.